Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the last of what has been a very busy semester here for us at the Joint Center. I think we've had a really wonderful set of events. I hope many of you have had a chance to join us for those. Today we'll be hearing from Sean Wu, one of our Meyer doctoral fellows, speaking about land finance and investment-led growth. As I noted, this is the last of our public events from the spring. If you missed any of those events and are interested in them, most of them are the videos of most of them are available on our website under the events tab. I will highlight one upcoming event, and upcoming in this case is actually a little bit away, but on Tuesday, June 24th, we will be releasing our annual State of the Nation's Housing Report, which is, of course, one of our signature reports. That'll be released in an event that will be both online, and for those of you who are in the Boston area, it will be in person as well at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. We're very excited by the opportunity to do that. Now on to today's event, and look forward over the summer, towards the end of the summer, to an announcement of what I expect will be another interesting and jam-packed event series in the fall. Sean Wu, as I mentioned, is a Meyer doctoral fellow. He'll be receiving his PhD in economics in just a few weeks here at Harvard, and then he will be moving to New York City, where he will become an assistant professor at the NYU's Stern School of Business. Today, Sean is going to be discussing research he did with funding from the Joint Center on land finance and economic growth. This is an interesting line of research. It explores the important, complex, and often overlooked interplay between land values and public spending on infrastructure. And there's a little bit of I think, a fascinating chicken and egg question here. Sean will, of course, go into much more detail. Sean's going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes. I'll then do Q&A with Sean. We'll be drawing on questions that we hope that you put into the Q&A feature here in Zoom, and we will wrap up no later than 1:15 p.m. Sean, it's all yours.
Excellent. Thanks for having me. Let me start by sharing my screen. So as David alluded to, the topic of today is about land growth. This is such a gigantic topic, such a massively important one. I'm certainly not the first to think about this. Indeed, if we look a bit into the literature, many economists and sort of public intellects have opined on this topic. Managing land has been such an important challenge for many governments throughout history. So if we dial back to 1990s, at the time when the Soviet Union was transitioning into a market economy, a group of well-known Western economists, including several Nobel Prize winners, wrote such a letter to Gorbachev expressing their opinion on how a government should manage land. So I'm just going to take a few excerpts just to establish the idea and to introduce us into this topic. They said that the component of land value arises from community growth and the provision of services, and that is the most sensible source of revenue for financing such public services that raise the rental value of surrounding land. So that's commonly on the value of land, which stems from economic growth. They further say that governments of developed nations do not collect land nearly as much as they could, and therefore they have to make use unnecessary taxes, such as income tax, sales tax, value-added tax, and so on. Instead, they suggest that the government should derive income from land to finance their expenditure. They also say that rent cannot be collected publicly simply by selling land outright at auction. That is because if we dispose of it in such a short period of time, that will result in an extreme depression in prices. Instead, a government could collect the rent annually, and this would provide access to land for people with very limited access to credit. So that's their opinion on how to utilize land sale versus rent. We're going to touch on all these topics today. For today's talk, I plan to proceed in two parts. I'll introduce some facts I'll show you the importance of land finance for several countries, in particular China. And I'll show that over time, the way government supplies land to the private sector, it's through a gradual supply. They could have done more, but they choose not to do more. And second, with the money derived from land sales or land lease, governments invest in infrastructure. And in particular, governments invest more heavily in infrastructure and other public capital during early stage of growth. So that's when the growth is fast, governments invest a lot of money. Then we're going to a theoretical framework that try to understand the mechanism of land finance and investment-led growth. And we'll try to speak to these facts I document. So these facts are well known, but what explains them? I will suggest that what would explain a gradual supply to the private sector is going to be a combination of two frictions. When the government is under financial constraints and it doesn't have the ability to commit to its future actions, it will indeed supply the land to the private sector in a gradual manner. And the last part of the paper, I suggest there might be a better design of the land contract rather than simple sale or simple lease that might improve the allocation. So without further ado, let me get started with the fact. So here, what I'm showing you is in the case of mainland China, I'm showing you in this orange line, the GDP. So over the past two decades, GDP has grown at a massive pace from about 1 to 2 trillion of US dollar to now about like 18 trillion of US dollar. On the left, all these bars plot components of government revenue. So in black, I show you the revenue derived from land sale. In China, government doesn't really sell land. They lease land through a 50-year or 70-year lease for commercial or residential use. But for simplicity and in line with the convention, I'll just call this long-term leases a sale. And the pink bar shows you the domestic value-added tax. The green bar is the corporate income tax, and then you have some other taxes and other non-tax revenue, which each account for less than 10% of the budgetary income. So here you see clearly that added together, government revenue accounts for about a quarter of GDP, and among all these components, land sale revenue is one of the most important. Let's notice that there is a large amount of literature that studies income tax, capital tax, value-added tax, and all these taxation tools. But there are very few papers, as far as I can tell, that focus on how government derives income from land. And that's what I'm set out to do. And this is by no means, the importance of land finance is by no means specific to mainland China. If we look at Hong Kong and Singapore, you'll see the similar idea. So here I'm plotting the government budget income by components for Hong Kong over the last 4 decades. The most important item is profits tax, and the second to most important item, which is in black and white, are land premium. So those are government income derived from land lease that both happened before 97 when it was under British government control and post 97 when it's under Chinese government control. Same idea with Singapore. So as you can see that among all these components of government budgetary income, land sale revenue, and what is called investment interest income, which partly derives from past land sales, is among the most important part. So that attests to the importance of land finance in its contemporaneous context. But it's this economy, even for them, they're not the first ones to use the land income. If we look back to 19th century in the US, land income played some role for the US during an era of internal improvements, during which governments invested heavily in roads, canals, railways, and other public capital. Land income played a role in both the federal government's budget, but also in the state government's budget for the Western frontier states. Coming back to today, such a practice of financing infrastructure spending and general government spending with land income is being adopted by places across the developing world, such as India, Vietnam, and Africa. And it's indeed a focal point of various policy reports by the World Bank and other institutions. So now let's acknowledge that land finance is important. How is it actually operated in reality? So now let me introduce to you two facts that are sort of already known, but this is the time we're gonna review them together and try to speak to these facts in with a theoretical model. So first, how does government transfer land to the private sector? In the case of mainland China, the government sells the land through long-term leases to real estate developer, to commercial building developers. And over the past 2 decades, the amount of land sold to the private sector accounts for expanded the total urban area by about 30%. And on the left, I'm showing you this in 1,000 square kilometer. Just as a reference, 1 square kilometer amounts to about 0.4 square mile. And Cambridge, which is where I'm in, has an area less than 17 square kilometer. So over the past 2 decades, China really had sold like thousands of times of the area of Cambridge to the private sector as part of the urbanization process. At each point of time, the government could have sold more, but they chose not to, which is one fact we're trying to explain today. Again, if we look to Hong Kong on the left and Singapore on the right, you will see that over the past 4 decades, Hong Kong has also massively expanded the land used by the private sector. So similar thing happened in Singapore as well. So that's the fact one I want to bring your focus on, which is that, again, government at any point of time could supply more land to the private sector, but they choose not to. So they do this in a fairly controlled manner. The second fact I want to point to connects to the government expenditure. So it is probably intuitive to you that for developing nations, it is in their interest to develop infrastructure early on. So to turn this into sort of a rigorous statistical association, what I'm showing you here is that I'm regressing GDP growth rate on the public investment or government investment to GDP ratio. For both variables, I take the 5-year average to reflect a growth, to reflect a long-term sort of growth rate. You see that when GDP growth rate is high, it is also when the government investment to GDP ratio is high. I can include economy fixed effects in this regression. So the data behind this regression are pulled across Asian growth miracles, including Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and China for the past 6 decades, and mainland China for the past 2 decades. So this pattern that government invests more heavily in infrastructure during early stage of development is not even unique to governments that use land finance. It's just broadly true. A different way of saying this is that if we regress 2 variables separately on the year, you will see that over time, the growth rate of each economy declines, and over time, the government investment to GDP ratio decline as well. So that's the fact 2 I want to focus on today, which is, again, governments choose to invest more in infrastructure during early stages of economic development. Over time, the government investment declines as well as, and the economic growth rate declines as well. So these are the facts I want to speak to with the theory. Now, when I get into the theory, I want to frequently connect back to the facts I'm speaking to. The goal of today is not to get into the technical details of such a theory, but I'll try to convey the setup, the essence, and the key intuitions of this theory. So we're going to present a growth model, but apart from sort of the traditional role of consumption, I'm going to think about public capital used in this economy. So when I say public capital, think about the infrastructure, such as roads, electricity networks, canals, and so forth. The government is set out to supply this capital to the economy, but they need money, and they're going to derive money by selling land to the private sector. I will show that in a frictionless world, which I'll define rigorously, it is optimal for the government to front load infrastructure investment. So that is the fact 1. That is the fact 2 we talk about. They want to build the roads early on during economic development. But curiously, it is not optimal for them to supply the land to the private sector in a gradual manner. It is actually optimal to maintain a steady amount of land supply, which I'll explain. Then I try to say that, of course, the world is not frictionless. For one thing, we know that the government faces financial constraints in borrowing. And for the other, we know that the governments can never commit to what it will do in 10 years. I'm not sure if this is a proper joke here, but for the current government, we're not even sure what's going to happen in 10 days, not to say in 10 years. So I will suggest that under the combination of financial constraints and the inability to commit to future actions, this could actually give rise to the rising pattern of land supply as observed in reality. And what I will not talk about a better design of land contract, but if you are interested, you can refer you to the paper. So let me try to briefly situate myself in the vast literature on public finance. Since Frank Ramsey, there's a long list of prominent papers studying optimal fiscal policy. By optimal fiscal policy, what this paper means is just taxation. And it's usually assumed that there's some exogenous demand for money by the government that has to be financed by taxation. So think about the government needs to fight a war or something. But in the context of economic growth and the provision of public capital to the economy, these are not exogenous. These are endogenous need of a government that tries to sort of maximize its national's utility. So here is the setting we're going to consider. We're going to consider a setting with endogenous need of government revenue, and these are going to be provided by land sale and land lease. You might be familiar with sort of certain articles and certain sort of ideas related to the economics of exhaustible resources, such as minerals or gas. There's even the idea of the resource curse by Sachs Warner, saying that economies that are endowed with abundant natural resources may end up doing less well. In a sense, they're kind of cursed and not developing their own economy. What sets my paper apart is the observation that land is different from exhaustible resources, in that land does not depreciate. And further, when analyzing sort of demand for natural resources such as gas, it's usually taken as given that there's an international demand and an international price. But that's not the case with land. The demand for land is very much local, and its price is very much dependent on the local economic growth. So those are the features our model is going to have, and it distinguishes our model from sort of traditional models of exhaustible resources. Some of you might heard about the famous cost conjecture regarding sort of the inability of a durable good monopoly to price its good above marginal cost. A lot of that analysis a lot of the papers carry out their analysis under a sort of partial equilibrium view, whereas here we're going to think about the whole economy determined in general equilibrium. And it's funny that if you read the Coase 1917 two-part paper, the prime example Coase himself gave is to say that assume that one person owns all the land in the US, and let's ask what this person is going to do. So that's exactly the analysis we'll try to carry out in this paper. And last, a few months back, before people sort of turned all the attention onto tariffs, there was a lot of attention on the real estate crisis and problems in China. Over years, there are many empirical papers written on this topic. People have also built quantitative macro models to embed fixed rules of land supply to study how that affects the macroeconomy. In this paper, I'm going to think about land finance as a policy choice. It's not exogenous. It does not operate by a rule. Rather, the governments choose to do it for a specific reason, and we're trying to explain why they do it in a gradual manner rather than any other manner. So with that, I have to introduce the model a bit more formally. So there will be some notation involved, but I'll try to explain all the intuition. At the end of the day, like I'll try to sort of show minimum equations using a combination of graphs and sort of words to convey the intuition. So we're going to consider an economy that's very close to neoclassic growth model. It's going to be a closed economy. Everything is fully deterministic and it's infinite horizon. So time starts from now and runs into the infinite future. Let's assume there's a representative household in this economy. So this household consumes two sources. It consumes a non-durable goods CT. Think of this as food, clothing, and consumer housing. In this model, I will not distinguish between housing and land. I will not model structure. So just whenever I say land, just think about housing consumption. This representative household consumes non-durable goods CT and housing in a separable utility, and it has a discount rate of rho. So it prefers current consumption to future consumption at a particular rate. Now, to derive LT amount of housing service and utility, the household can proceed in two ways. It could own some housing or some land by the amount of HT at a value at a housing price or land price PT, and it can rent the rest from the government at a rent DT. Both the price and the rent will be determined endogenously at equilibrium. So as I've mentioned before, in reality, governments rarely sell land. A lot of them do a long-term leases of 5 decades, 7 decades, or even 1 century. But for simplicity, I'm just gonna model long-term lease as sale. And I'm gonna, what I'll call lease is gonna be short-term rental. So think about a 5-year lease in reality. I assume that there's 1 unit of land in this economy. Part of them is HT amount is owned by the private sector. The rest is owned by the government, and the government rents part of it to the private sector. So that's the allocation of land in this economy. Technically, I will assume that this utility parameter sigma governing housing consumption will be larger than 1. This will give rise to inelastic demand for housing, which is the empirically relevant case. So that is the consumption side of the economy. Let me repeat. So there's housing and there is non-durable consumption. How is the non-durable consumption produced? Let me introduce the production side of the economy. So I assume that there's the production side only uses two things, 2 inputs. One is the public capital, which I call ZT, one is labor. And I will further assume that households, in carrying out their production, they take this public capital or infrastructure ZT as given. So the idea is that for everybody, if there are better roads, better electricity networks, it makes them more productive. But they don't supply it themselves. They take it as given because those are supplied by the government. So in economics jargon, this means that there is an externality in this economy. Because households takes infrastructure as given, they're not paying for it. So someone has to pay for it. In this model, it's gonna be the government. Now, at the end of the day, there is a resource constraint in this economy. That is because given however much YT the economy produces at any point of time, it's either consumed or it's used to grow the infrastructure capital stock, or it is used to replenish depreciated infrastructure with a depreciation rate delta. To connect to one of the facts I brought up at the beginning, I'm gonna define IT as the ratio of consumption to GDP, and its complement is gonna be the investment to GDP ratio. So one of the facts we've seen at the beginning is that over time, governments invest less and less in public capital relative to GDP. So a different way of saying it is that this consumption ratio IT will grow over time. So at the beginning, people consume less because a lot of resources are used as investment. But over time, as the roads are built, roads are getting better, people consume more and more, given however much it is produced. So what is the core issue in this economy? The core issue is that there's a externality, and there is a budget constraint by the government. Because this infrastructure is output enhancing, the government wants to provide it, but the government has to derive money to finance this infrastructure spending. So they will do so by supplying land to the private sector, which is introduced on the previous slide. I'm gonna start the economy. We're gonna think about the economy that started with a certain amount of land H0 that's already held in the private sector. It starts with initial infrastructure stock, which I assume is pretty low. So there will be economic growth towards a steady state in this economy. So that is the set of the model. At a high level, what am I trying to achieve with this model? I'm trying to introduce the role of land and the role of public investment into an economic growth model. There will be a role of a benevolent government to provide such infrastructure. I'll assume that for simplicity, when the land is not used by the private sector, it's just idle. It is more extreme than necessary, but the point is to show that even though land sits idle, sitting idle incurs utility loss, it might still be in the interest of the government to control the land supply if that brings in higher revenue. The idea is that if you supply too much land to the economy, that might depress the price by too much and bring in less revenue for the government. So even though the government wants the private sector to consume more land, it also wants to derive income to invest in infrastructure, which might result in a suboptimal, less than one supply of land to the private sector. I'll assume away any land tax. So in reality, there's no land tax. There's some property tax, but the property tax is a taxation on both the structure and the land value, and it's very hard to implement because many houses are off the market. There's no fair market price for them. I also abstract away from other taxation sort of instruments the government usually uses in reality, such as capital taxation, income taxation, and so forth. One could introduce all these elements, in which case the government is just gonna balance among all these levers. But in our model and in any generalized model, having the possibility of deriving land income is always better than not having it. Because from the government's perspective, if I don't need this income, I'll just supply all the land to the private sector and rebate all my profits to the households. Now, with this remarks, let me get into some of the formal results. Again, as I said, I'll try to illustrate this using a combination of graph and words just to convey the idea. So what is the best thing that could happen in this economy? By that I mean, there's no government budget constraint. There's just one resource constraint. So I'm just gonna allow you, given however much that could be produced in this economy, allow someone to optimally pick the resource allocation in this economy. In this, what I call first best allocation, the government is gonna give all the land to the private sector just because they value them. But the specific amount that's owned by the private sector versus rented by the private sector from households is irrelevant. Under the assumption that at the end of the day, households care about the total amount of land they can consume, the total amount of housing they can consume. They don't really care about it, whether they're rented or whether they buy it from the government. At this optimal allocation, the consumption growth rate in this economy would be equal to the marginal product of capital, which is, if I give you an actual unit of public capital, how much actual output can you produce? The consumption growth would be equal to the marginal product of capital minus the depreciation rate and minus time discount rate. So if any of you has ever seen the neoclassical growth model, this is exactly the same formula. So in this economy, what would happen is that in this phase diagram, I'm showing you the combination of consumption C and infrastructure stock Z on this graph. So if the economy starts at the level where there's low infrastructure stock and there's low consumption level, it will continue to grow until it reaches the steady state. At such a steady state, households consume certain part of the output, and the rest of the output is used to replenish the depreciated infrastructure and maintain the same infrastructure stock. So this is the best thing that could ever happen in this economy. And this is the implied growth path of this economy. However, as we said, that in this economy, there's externality. So it is not in the interest for the households to pay for any roads. It is a public good. And it has to be provided by the government. So this resource constraint is not the only constraint in this economy. The government, in choosing its economic policy, also has to obey a budget constraint. And that is to say, it has to respect sort of the equilibrium allocation in this economy. So let's think about what is an equilibrium in this economy? What does an equilibrium entail? So at any equilibrium in this economy, the land rent could be expressed as the fraction of marginal utility of land consumption over the marginal utility of non-durable consumption. And this formula tells us that the land rent declines the total amount of land supplied to the economy, which should be intuitive. If there's more land, then my marginal utility to pay, marginal sort of willingness to pay for each unit of land becomes smaller. What is the land price? The land price, since land does not depreciate, land price accumulates all this possible rents derived from this piece of land into the infinite future. Technically, that means the land price not only declines in the current supply of land, but also in the future supply of land. So the idea, again, should be intuitive in that when is the land valuable? The land is more valuable when you know that in the future, there's no more land supplied to the economy. The flip way, the other way to say this is that if the government wants to maximize the price of a unit of land it sells today, what it should announce is that this will be the last piece of land I will ever sell to the economy. Going from tomorrow onward, there will be no further land added to this economy. So this will lead to a maximum land price for per unit of land today. However, that is an announcement. And that announcement is subject to a time inconsistency issue in the sense that for today, it is in the government's interest to announce that I will never sell any more land in the future, so you should pay me a higher price. But when tomorrow comes, what is sold is already sold. The government has already pocketed the proceedings. So when tomorrow comes, I'll say again, I'm going to sell you an extra bit of land, but no other land from the day after tomorrow. So period by period, the government is always sort of interested in reneging its past promises. And this will create sort of a time inconsistency problem in our economy. Last, let me know that in this economy, the land rent and land price will both increase in the non-durable consumption in this economy, which sort of rigorously delivers the intuition we had and the intuition we saw at the beginning, which is to say, land value is higher when the economy is more prosperous. There is a sort of loop in this economy in that if the economy is doing better, land price is higher, the government will derive more income from selling land and thus invest more in infrastructure, which will in turn aid economic growth. So it is a positive feedback loop the government can pull in this economy. Now, let me present sort of the second and the last sort of formal results for today, and then I'll try to sort of deliver the intuition for the rest of the results. So let's consider a realistic government, but we'll assume that the government could commit to its future actions. And so the government has to obey its government budget constraint. For every bit of infrastructure spending, the money has to come from somewhere, either from land sale or land lease. But let's assume that it can commit to its future actions. So when it says that in the future of 10 years, this is the amount of land I will supply to the economy, it can stick to it. It can stick to its promise. And also, let's assume that the government faces no financial constraint, so it can freely borrow and lend. In this case, there will be sort of a constraint on the government budget. And imagine how tight the government budget constraint is. Technically, there is a Lagrangian multiplier lambda that is larger than 0. Lambda embeds sort of the social value of money in government hands. Because if government gets an extra dollar, they could use this extra dollar to invest in infrastructure to enhance the economy. But government is constrained by its budget. It cannot invest as much as they want. Hence, there's a positive sort of multiplier of government money. In this case, the total amount of land supplied to the economy will be time invariant. That's to say, at the beginning, if the government decides this is the amount of land I'll supply to the economy, they will always stick to this level without increasing the supply in the future. The time invariance really comes from the fact that land does not depreciate. So if I decided that in this economy, if as a government, I decide that in 10 years, I'm going to supply more land to the private sector, I might as well just give them the land today so that they can, from now to 10 years later, they can consume this amount of land. But the total amount of land the government decides to supply would be declining in this lambda multiplier. That is to say, the higher the social value of public fund, the smaller amount of land the government will supply to the economy. The reason is that by shrinking the land supply, the government achieves a higher price for per piece of land. So it achieves, together it can achieve a higher revenue. But by shrinking the land supply to the economy, it's hurting the household because they have less land to consume. So the government is just balancing between these two considerations. If the government is poor, meaning that this social value public fund is larger, it's going to get closer to the limit of maximizing revenue. So this is what this graph shows you. And crucially, in this economy, when owning a land versus leasing a land does not incur any sort of utility difference, then the private sector and the government, they don't care about how much of land is held, is owned versus rented, because they all bring the same utility. What's relevant is only the total amount of land that's available to consume for the household. In terms of its economic growth, it is going to be characterized again by the consumption growth. The formula looks a bit more cumbersome, but let me just give you the intuition. So previously, this black terms would exist previously. The consumption growth is going to be the marginal product of capital minus the depreciation rate minus the discount rate. However, there is a further gap due to sort of a poor government existing in this economy. Because the capital is lower, there's not enough capital compared to the first best allocation. The marginal product of capital will be too high, but the consumption growth will be lower because part of the resource is allocated towards capital investment. And I do show that in this environment, it is optimal for the government to target a consumption ratio that rises over time. So this rationalizes the fact 2 of C, which is to say, it is in the interest of the government to invest in infrastructure early on. At the beginning, when the economy is poor, I spend a lot more resources on investment. And later on, when the economy is richer, people get to consume more. And it is optimal for them. In terms of economic growth, on the left, that's the growth path I've shown you before. So if if the government is not constrained in this economy, starting from a low infrastructure stock and low consumption, this is a growth path the economy will see. But if the government is constrained, turning to the right, the long-term steady state shifts to the left, and the growth path changes as well. So the economy still grows, but it never grows to a point where the infrastructure stock is desirable. So it persistently has a low infrastructure stock because the government is poor. And at this point, government has already sort of made their optimal policy. So because they're constrained, the second best allocation is different, is worse than the first best allocation. Now, let me give you the intuition of the rest of the theory without getting into the details. So What we have already shown is that if we assume that there's no financial friction in economic jargons, that means financial markets are complete, and we assume that the government could commit to future action. So if the government makes a promise, about 10 years later, it can keep to that promise. In this case, the optimal allocation, that's feature front-loaded infrastructure investment that's a bit lower than optimal, but the total amount of land supplied to the economy would be time invariant rather than growing in time, as we see in reality. So how do we explain the gradual supply of land to the economy? I show that for these two constraints, if you relax either one, it doesn't bind. There's a way to get around it. For example, on this second quadrant, if you say that the government can still commit to its future action, but they cannot borrow, it turns out that the government can implement the same allocation, but gradually sell land to the economy. The idea is that land is both a consumption good and the asset. If at the beginning of the growth development stage, if the government needs to invest more, if the government needs more money, then the government sell more land. Later on, when the government needs less money, the government lease more land. But the government can do so while maintaining the same stock of land supplied to the economy. Similarly, if you assume that there's still no financial constraint, but the government cannot commit to its future actions, which is to say they're discretionary in every period, there's also a way for the government to credibly incentivize future governments. They can do so by issuing a complex set of debts. The debts consist of long-term bonds such that the long-term bond will revalue adversarially if future governments choose a different plan. That's not meant to be realistic, but that illustrates that these two frictions collectively bind, but either each individual friction can be getting around. Indeed, in the paper, I show that realistically, we know that financial markets are incomplete. Governments cannot issue any amount of debt they want, and they cannot credibly commit to its future actions. So when both frictions are present, what I call sort of double deviation allocation will indeed feature gradual supply of land to the private sector, as we see in reality. So if we take stock, what we observe is that we've provided a model to understand land finance and public investment. We provided an explanation for rising land supply, which is to say the government is subject to both this financial constraints and an inability to commit to future actions. And last in the paper, I offer some suggestions on designing a better land contract. So beyond this paper, I find this topic overall very promising and exciting. This paper really just scratches the surface and only talks about sort of efficiency in a deterministic world. But we know that the world is not deterministic. A big factor in the pricing of land and housing is that I don't know how well the economy is going to be 10 years later. So it is in the interest to build a model that incorporates stochastic growth. Further, such a model could also allow us to study cyclical fluctuations and economic crisis. For example, in the case of China, when the economy growth slows down, housing price goes down. This sort of tightens the government budget constraint, which might lead the government to invest less in infrastructure, exacerbating sort of economic slowdown. And in particular, there are other mechanisms through which sort of land could matter in such an economy. For example, if land is used as a collateral, if land value falls, firms or governments can borrow less money. This might exacerbate any sort of financial crisis. In this economy, I consider sort of a single government supplying land to the whole economy. In reality, in the case of China, the land is not supplied by a central government. it's supplied by various municipal governments. So there is an element of competition among local governments. And last, in this model, I only consider a representative agent, but there's a lot of distributional impact related to housing. As housing wealth is such a big component in individual wealth. In the case of China, people who bought houses 20 years ago are now much richer than people who didn't buy it. So what is the distributional and inequality implications of such a land finance policy? These are all the interesting topics that I hope I can keep exploring, and I hope others would be interested in exploring. So I'll end here, and it is a great pleasure to present my work to you. And I'm happy to um, keep talking online and take some of your questions.
Thank you, Sean. I have to tell you that this is near and dear to my heart. Before I did housing and before I was doing some urban governance work in Boston, I spent about 10 or 15 years on a variety of projects related to infrastructure, and how investment decisions are made, more from a political economy point of view. So I never got to this detail of calculations, but um, you remind me of many things. I'm intrigued. I had made a note to myself about what turned out to be your third point for future research about this is different. And part of my experience is almost entirely U.S.
Mhm.
Um,
Please,
including
all yours.
including including some effort to understand the whole 19th century fights on not fights but debates about internal improvements, which actually continue in some forms to the present day, but certainly through the mid 20th century. In the Chinese example or the any of the others, who's making the decision about infrastructure investment? Presumably, because infrastructure is networks, it's got to be a higher level government. Is that right?
Yeah, it's actually it depends on what kind we're talking about. If we're talking about, say, building airports,
Yeah.
those are sort of usually under the command of municipal governments. But it is true that, say, there are some larger scale projects like highways that requires a bit more coordination that might come from like the higher hierarchies.
Yeah. No, and again, that I guess I was thinking about the networked infrastructure. Airports turn out to be a critical you really can't have a really thriving local economy without a first-rate airport. People just but things like railroads or roads, to a certain extent, power systems, water
Right, there's a
water
bit
and
more
wastewater
substantial
winds up
planning
winds up
there.
winds up winds
Yeah.
up differently. Um, because I think what your intuition, and I don't know how you've thought about it. So when the national government in the Chinese context decides, we're going to build a high-speed rail network, are they using land sales to finance that,
That is
or
actually
or
so.
or the national highway
Roads are
system?
more so the infrastructure. Yes, I mean partly so, but there are also sort of roads are kind of like complex. I mean that like the reason I brought up sort of airport is like sort of I was talking about this model sort of from the perspective of national governments in the interest of all nationals. But in reality, when you think about sort of municipal government's interest, like there is an element of competition among them. Like it might be optimal for the national government to decide I'm gonna only build like 300 airports across the nation, but every cities want their own, right? It's like in the US, every city wants to offer tax rebates to Amazon so that Amazon could headquarter in the city. So there is a lot of, in a sense, like redundancy that might result from such sort of suboptimal coordination among different sort of city municipal governments.
Yeah, no, and certainly if you look at the history of U.S. airports, which I've actually, for better or for ill, something I've done, right? That the large airports, the Logans, the LaGuardias, right, for the most part are self-financing. But for political reasons, we have a system, historically have had a system of many smaller airports, and the smaller they get, then you see some national financing. The other thing is that an airport system can't work without a national air traffic control system. and arguably an international air traffic control. So it gets to be just a very,
That's right. That's right.
a
Yeah.
very, I mean, partly what I was thinking about was, and again, I think this was the intuition behind your point, which is when you have local governments competing, one of the things, we tend to think of government systems of the federal government kind of giving orders to below, but certainly in the US context, and my hunch is in other contexts, there's also local governments and local elites lobbying up.
That's right. That's right. I mean, even like in China, I'm sure like similar things happen because it's just like political economy. Like people do want to like municipal leaders want to demonstrate that they manage the economy well, but like how do they manage the economy well? Part of them is like
Yep.
technically like stealing business from other cities.
Yep. Yep. No, it's and obviously driving up the land value. How do you the other again thinking putting on my old infrastructure hat, is fun here is um I mean, it seems like you almost have to make some assumption about the wisdom of whatever infrastructure investment choices people are making. And again, the
That's
literature,
right.
certainly in the US context, is full of long stories of, there's a whole literature of, did the Army Corps of Engineers cook the books on their varying cost benefit analyses? So just wondering how you wrestle with that question.
Yeah,
Or
that's
do
a
you
very
just take
interesting
take some
point. Like,
assumption?
I mean, for me, like I'm just at the sort of starting project as the starting point, I'm just assuming the government is so benevolent, it really sort of reasons in their interest of all nationals. But in reality, like especially when you consider sort of political economy aspect and sort of municipal government's aspect, say, for example, in the case of investing in roads, like is Massachusetts gonna pay for this highway? But you might argue that having this highway in Massachusetts benefits New Jersey and Connecticut and other places too. Like, so there's a lot of like externality that may or may not be taken into account if sort of the cost benefits analysis is carried out sort of at the lower level rather than at a more sort of at a level where like every sort of beneficial, every related parties are involved.
Yeah, no, and again, having dug into these debates, including spending several years trying to understand the political economy of the Big Dig project in Boston, that discussion, right? To what extent is this a local beneficiary? To what extent is it regional? And to what extent is it through
Exactly.
and
Exactly. Because ideally, you might want to say, like, to the extent that there are many parties involved, some are more directly benefiting from this, some are more indirectly. Maybe they should all pitch in,
yeah,
right? Like, because the direct benefits, they should like pay for its cost.
yeah,
But that scope is pretty hard to sort of pin down.
yeah. Flipping, since we are the Joint Center for Housing, I guess I should ask you a housing related question. Um,
Please.
well, I was thinking about and it's got sort of two pieces. Well, I guess they're both of a piece, right? In your model, kind of land is land, but particularly if you're thinking about highways, exactly where your land is located. So and this is a classic debate. This is bedeviled every high-speed rail debate. Um, in the sense of I'm like, how close am I to that key piece of infrastructure? And
Exactly.
really true with housing. So I don't know
That's right.
I don't know how you take
They're
into
they're,
account.
they're very sort of interesting sort of empirical papers, more sort of disaggregated microeconomic in scope. That's about say what's the value of getting closer to a subway station or getting
Yeah,
closer to a highway, right? Because in the model, I'm just saying all land is homogeneous. They're all in a sense that
right.
like once there is better infrastructure, all land appreciates, but in reality, they appreciate differentially, right? So one interesting thing which we sort of touched upon in our like email correspondence is that in the city of Shenzhen, and I'm sure, I suppose in some other Chinese cities, when governments develop subways, they sort of partner the infrastructure development is partnered with real estate development because they know that once I build this subway I build this new line, so the nearby land will appreciate, nearby housing price will appreciate. So I might just as well capture that value by myself, and I could use that value to fund this infrastructure spending.
Yeah, no, I think that intuition and the flip, which I think was caught in your distributional question, is um, you can be too close to the highway, and if the transit line is above ground, many years ago, I think Matt Kahn did some really interesting work about land values with transit investments as to whether or not that transit investment was underground or not. Because now I've also introduced a negative. Any of us who've ever, lived near a busy highway know it can be,
Yeah,
well, it's
yeah,
not only unpleasant, but arguably also unhealthy. And
that's
again,
right.
I don't
That's
know,
right.
I don't know, and the other thing we certainly know from history of highway building in the U.S., and wouldn't be surprised in other countries, is often if you're going through an existing residential area, there are some real losers. People wind up losing their houses and their community.
Yeah, yeah. No, that is a sort of a thing in China too. Is like when you need to build some new infrastructure, you have to relocate part of the population, and then they could be starving there for whatever reason. They just prefer to be there. So moving them could actually be very costly as well.
Um, I'm cognizant that we're coming to time,
Hmm.
and you hinted at, and I guess just my curiosity gets me. Um, the change in the sort of Chinese real estate crisis. I don't know both your sense of, did that wind up changing some of your thinking or understanding of these dynamics, and what are you observing on the ground in terms of like your data, if I read it right, looked like it went up to about 2021, but at least anecdotally, what are you hearing about land?
Right. No, I think anecdotally, it is people kind of know that sort of land value has been falling, partly contributing to some sort of fiscal problems of local governments. I mean, in the case of China, there is sort of a complex revenue sharing agreement among local governments and the central government. So, I mean, at the end of the day, like there's gonna be sort of budgetary holes in the sort of consolidated government budget. There are like the government's using other means to raise value, like to raise money, like more taxation and stuff. But
Mhm.
people are worried that like going out of this sort of high economic growth era, the land finance might not be like that sustainable in the future.
Yeah, and as you point out, at a certain point, you've sold off land. We've got a couple of there are a couple questions that came
Hmm.
online that are trying to think about in the U.S. context, at least, as you point out. Certainly in most urban areas, there's not huge amounts of publicly owned land, but in fact, you know, most most localities actually own a fair bit of land, interspersed. And so, one question is, okay, if I'm the city of Boston or the city of New York, and it turns out I don't need this vacant lot anymore, um, in your model, it seems like the government sells it to maximize revenue. A couple people are asking about it, how would you think about, is it worth thinking about the implications of selling or long-term leasing specifically for affordable housing? Um, and
Right, right. Yeah, now affordable housing is like again like sort of touching upon the distributional impact of this, right? Like if the city is growing, housing prices getting better, if you've already bought a house in the past, you benefit from this appreciation, but there are people who are left behind, right? So you might just want to like tweak your policy to take care of sort of more distributional impact. I mean, it's probably, only remotely related because to my knowledge, like a lot of sort of US universities, like let's say, there are kind of like built upon lands granted by the government, right? Like a lot of land grant universities, like in a sense, it's about trying to sort of take care of not for profit institutions by sort of in a way subsidizing them.
so, yes, you're right. I mean, every state has a land grant university, and certainly, I know there was just a major meeting up at the American Academy for Arts and Sciences, thinking about in cities, what is the responsibility of the large institutional nonprofit owners? hospitals, universities. We've come to the end of our time. A couple thoughts here. The Meyer Fellowship is really special because it allows the Joint Center to advance its mission of trying to um, help, support the development of the next generation of scholars. Folks
My
haven't.
pleasure.
Yeah, and my generation apparently did not manage to solve the housing problem. So and to me, it's also a chance for us to support research that goes beyond what a lot of the work that we do. And it's one of the really fun things about the Meyer is just getting this chance. We're just actually in the process of reviewing next year's Meyer applicants, and just
Excellent.
the range of what people are working on and the questions they raise is really fascinating. I think the other thing that I really appreciate out of this was, um, looking at this, looking at your paper and originally going, how does this connect? Let me get to try to understand this. And then listening to your presentation and finding the questions that came up in my mind and among attendees, just really made me both appreciate the fact that you've taken on this question that, as you note, has often been kind of ignored or kind of waved away, and really generated interesting thinking. I love the fact that, as you,
I'm very delighted to hear that.
yeah, no, it's really fun. A couple people have also asked if this, as with all of our webinars, the recording will be posted. It should be up on the Joint Center website by next week. I want to just thank you for a terrific presentation. It's wonderful you've been a Meyer Fellow, and we look forward to following your work in New York, but you still have to keep rooting for the Boston teams. Have a
Thanks for
great,
inviting me.
you're welcome. Have a great day, everybody. Get outside and enjoy what looks like, I think, relatively decent weather. And feel free to reach out to us or to Sean if you've got additional questions. Thank you a lot, Sean, and thank you.
Excellent. Take care.
Bye-bye.
See you out there.